The 911 dispatcher's voice crackles through the recording, calm and professional, asking the standard questions. Then comes the voice on the other end, a woman, breathless and confused. She had been standing in her kitchen when she heard it, clear as day, her daughter calling to her from the woods behind their property. The voice was unmistakable, carrying that familiar pitch and cadence that only years of motherhood could recognize. "Mom, please come help me," it called out, trembling with fear. She ran to the back door, ready to rush into the darkness, when her phone buzzed in her pocket. A text message from her daughter, sent from 50 miles away at college, asking what they should have for dinner when she came home that weekend. This is where our journey begins, at the intersection of the familiar and the impossible, where the voices we trust become instruments of deception. For thousands of years, across every continent and culture, humanity has told stories of things that wear the faces and mimic the voices of those we love. The Native Americans spoke of skinwalkers, beings that could slip into the skin of animals and humans alike. European folklore trembled at the mention of doppelgangers, exact duplicates that appeared as omens of death. In Japan, they whispered of the kitsune, fox spirits that assumed human form to trick the unwary. Modern hikers and campers continue to report the same unsettling phenomenon, hearing loved ones calling from impossible distances. Voices that sound right but feel deeply, terribly wrong. What if the very things that connect us to each other, the unique timbre of a voice, the specific way someone says your name, could be turned against us? What if the forest, the darkness, the unknown, learn to speak in the language of trust? This is the question that haunts every account, every recorded encounter, every testimony of vocal mimicry in the wild. We will explore not just creatures hiding in shadows, but entities that weaponize intimacy itself. The winter forest of 1891 held a silence so complete it seemed to press against the eardrums of those who dared travel through it. In the vast stretches of boreal wilderness that spread across northern Manitoba, where spruce trees stood like frozen sentinels and the snow lay deep enough to swallow a man whole, a group of Cree hunters made a discovery that would haunt the historical record for generations to come. They found one of their own, a trapper named Joseph, crouched over the remains of his hunting partner. What made this scene particularly horrifying was not simply the act itself, but what Joseph had become in the eyes of those who knew him. His face, they would later report, had changed. Not physically perhaps, but in some essential way that transcended mere appearance. He looked at them with eyes that held no recognition, no humanity, only an insatiable hunger that seemed to emanate from something far deeper than his empty stomach. This was not an isolated incident. Across the indigenous communities of the northern forests, from the shores of Lake Superior to the remote reaches of the Canadian Shield, people had long spoken of a transformation that could overtake a human being during the hardest months of winter. They called it becoming Wendigo, and it represented something far more terrifying than simple madness or desperation. It was, according to the oral traditions passed down through countless generations, a complete replacement of the human soul with something ancient, malevolent, and forever ravenous. The Algonquian peoples, whose territories stretched across the northern woodlands of what is now Canada and the northern United States, developed the Wendigo legend as both a cautionary tale and an explanation for a phenomenon they had witnessed too many times throughout their history. The creature, as described in their stories, began as a human being, perhaps a hunter separated from his group during a blizzard, perhaps a family isolated by disease or misfortune, perhaps simply someone who found themselves facing starvation in the merciless depths of winter when the temperature could plummet to 40 below zero and remain there for weeks on end. In that moment of ultimate desperation, when the choice came down to survival or death, some individuals made the forbidden choice. They consumed human flesh. In doing so, according to the legend, they initiated a transformation that could never be reversed. What made the Wendigo particularly terrifying in indigenous tradition was not merely its cannibalistic nature, but the specific way it mimicked humanity. The creature, once transformed, retained its human appearance. It could walk upright, speak words, even recognize and call out to former friends and family members. But those who encountered a Wendigo described a profound wrongness in its imitation of human behavior. The movements were slightly off, too jerky or too fluid. The voice carried an edge of hunger that never quite disappeared. Most disturbing of all, the eyes reflected nothing of the person who once inhabited that body. The Wendigo wore a human being like a costume, using the familiar face and form to lure others close enough to become its next meal. Basil Johnston, an Ojibwe teacher and scholar, recorded oral histories in which elders described the Wendigo as growing larger with each person it consumed, yet never satisfied. Its heart, they said, was made of ice, and no amount of flesh could warm it or fill the void within. This eternal hunger drove the creature to hunt relentlessly, and its preferred prey was always those who might trust it, who might see the familiar human form and lower their guard long enough for the Wendigo to strike. In 1902, anthropologist A. Irving Hallowell began documenting what he termed Wendigo psychosis among Cree and Ojibwe communities. Working with indigenous informants across northern Ontario and Manitoba, Hallowell compiled case studies of individuals who either believed themselves to be transforming into Wendigos or were identified by their communities as having undergone the chain. What struck Hallowell and subsequent researchers was the consistency of the reported symptoms across vast geographical distances and distinct tribal groups. The afflicted individuals would develop an aversion to normal food, claiming it turned to ash in their mouth. They would experience vivid dreams of hunting and consuming human flesh. Most tellingly, they would express a growing fear of their own impulses, often begging their families to restrain them or, in extreme cases, to kill them before they could harm others. One particularly well-documented case from 1907 involved a Cree trapper named Jack Fiddler, who served as a shaman and community leader in the region around Sandy Lake in northern Ontario. Fiddler claimed to have killed 14 Wendigos over the course of his lifetime, and by his testimony and the accounts of community members, these were not monsters in the traditional sense, but people in the process of transformation. The killings, performed with the consent and often the plea of the afflicted individuals themselves, were seen as acts of mercy, preventing the full transformation and protecting the community from the horror that would follow. The Canadian authorities, unable or unwilling to understand the cultural context, arrested Jack Fiddler in 1907 when he was nearly 87 years old. The charge was murder. Before his trial could conclude, Fiddler died by suicide, hanging himself in his cell. His brother Joseph, who had assisted in some of the killings, was convicted and sentenced to prison, though he was later pardoned and released. The case drew attention from anthropologists and journalists across North America, many of whom dismissed the Wendigo belief as primitive superstition. Yet, they could not easily explain why communities separated by hundreds of miles, with limited contact, described the phenomenon in such strikingly similar terms. Duncan Cameron, a fur trader working for the Northwest Company in the late 1700s, recorded in his journal an encounter that might provide insight into the psychological reality behind the legend. While trading at a remote post in what is now northern Minnesota, Cameron wrote of a voyageur who had survived a brutal winter isolated in the wilderness. The man returned to the trading post in spring, gaunt and hollow-eyed, and refused to speak of what he had done to survive. The other voyageurs, many of them Metis with deep connections to indigenous culture, avoided him completely. They claimed they could see the change in him, that he no longer moved or spoke quite like a man. Within a month, the isolated voyageur had disappeared back into the forest. Cameron noted that the indigenous hunters refused to search for him, saying it was already too late, that he belonged to the Wendigo now. The psychological mechanism behind Wendigo psychosis remains a subject of debate among modern researchers. Some anthropologists argue it represents a culturally specific form of psychosis, shaped by the extreme environmental stresses of survival in subarctic conditions, and given form by the powerful Wendigo mythology embedded in Algonquian culture. Others suggest it served as a social control mechanism, a way for communities to identify and remove individuals who had crossed the ultimate taboo and posed a genuine threat to group survival. The consumption of human flesh, even in dire circumstances, could establish a psychological pattern that might make such behavior more likely in the future, creating a legitimate danger that communities had to address. But there is another layer to the Wendigo legend that speaks to something deeper in human psychology. The creature represents the fear of losing one's humanity while retaining the outward form of a person. It embodies the terror of transformation, of becoming something monstrous that wears your own face. In the harsh environment of the northern wilderness, where survival often demanded brutal choices and unimaginable hardships, the line between human and monster could blur with frightening ease. The Wendigo served as a stark reminder of that boundary and the catastrophic consequences of crossing it. The concept of mimicry as a predatory adaptation appears throughout nature. The anglerfish dangles a lure that mimics prey to attract victims. The zone-tailed hawk mimics the flight pattern of vultures to approach its targets undetected. Certain species of orchids mimic the appearance and scent of female insects to attract males for pollination. In each case, the mimicry exploits the target's instincts, using familiar signals to bypass natural defenses. The Wendigo, whether understood as literal monster or cultural metaphor, represents this same principle applied to human social bonds. It weaponizes trust, familiarity, and the fundamental human tendency to recognize and respond to other humans. The frozen wilderness of the North provided the perfect setting for such horror. In those vast expanses of forest and snow, humans survived only through cooperation, through maintaining tight-knit communities that shared resources and protected one another. The appearance of something that looked human but had lost all humanity represented a fundamental violation of the trust upon which survival depended. It was betrayal in its purest form, made worse by the knowledge that the monster was once a member of the community, someone who had shared meals and stories and the warmth of the fire. Indigenous oral histories contain accounts of entire families isolated by winter storms, where one member would succumb to the Wendigo transformation and systematically hunt the others. The survivors of such ordeals, when they existed, described the unique horror of being stalked by someone they loved. Someone whose face they knew intimately, whose voice called their name with terrible familiarity. The Wendigo did not simply kill. It corrupted the bonds of kinship and community, turning them into weapons. As we examine the Wendigo legend through the lens of documented history and anthropological study, we find ourselves confronting uncomfortable truths about human nature and the fragility of civilization. The transformation from person to monster, from community member to predator, required no supernatural intervention in the stories where starvation and desperation pushed individuals beyond the accepted boundaries of behavior. The legend simply gave form to a genuine phenomenon, a psychological breaking point that indigenous communities had observed and documented long before Western anthropologists arrived to study it. The last widely reported case of suspected Wendigo transformation occurred in 1958 in the forests near Barrens River in Manitoba. The details remain sparse, partly because the community handled the matter internally, and partly because by that time, the intersection of indigenous belief systems and Canadian law had become fraught with tragic history. But the stories persist in those northern communities, passed down as warnings and reminders. The Wendigo still walks through winter tales told around fires, still serves its purpose as the guardian of that crucial boundary between human and monster, still reminds us that the face we trust most might conceal something we cannot afford to ignore. The Alaskan wilderness holds secrets that refuse translation into comfortable language. Among the spruce forests that climb towards snow-capped peaks, along the countless inlets where freshwater meets the Pacific, the Tlingit people have passed down warnings for generations. These are not bedtime stories meant to entertain children. They are survival instructions wrapped in the language of myth, and they concern something the Tlingit call Kushtaka, the land otter men. The first thing you need to understand about the Kushtaka is that they exist in the space between worlds. Neither fully human nor completely animal, these shapeshifters move through the coastal rainforests and along riverbanks with a specific and terrible purpose. They hunt for the lost, the confused, the isolated. According to Tlingit tradition, the Kushtaka can take many forms, but they favor the appearance of otters when in their natural state, and when they want to lure someone close, they become something far more sinister. They mimic voices. Specifically, they mimic the voices of those you love most in this world. Imagine for a moment that you are alone in the wilderness. Perhaps you are a fisherman checking trap lines along a remote creek. Perhaps you are a logger who has wandered too far from camp. The forest around you is thick with vegetation, the kind of primordial growth that blocks sunlight and muffles sound. In these places, distances become meaningless. A voice 50 yards away might sound like it is coming from right beside you, or a sound originating just beyond the next tree might seem to echo from half a mile distant. Your senses, the tools you rely on for survival, become unreliable. Then you hear it, a child crying. The sound cuts through the dense air with crystal clarity. It is not the general sound of any child. It is specific. It might be your daughter's voice, or your son's, or your younger siblings. The tone, the cadence, even the particular way they gasp between sobs is perfect. Every parent knows their child's cry the way they know their own heartbeat. And this cry is begging for help. What do? Every instinct screams at you to run toward that sound. A child in distress activates something primal in the human psyche, something that bypasses rational thought and demands immediate action. But the Tlingit elders would tell you to stop, to listen more carefully, to ask yourself whether your child could possibly be in this place, at this time. Because if the answer is no, if your child is safely at home, or at school, or anywhere other than this particular stretch of wilderness, then what you are hearing is not your child at all. It is something wearing your child's voice like a mask. The documented encounters with Kushtaka span more than a century, though the oral tradition reaches back much further. In the early 1900s, when canneries and logging operations began bringing outsiders into Tlingit territory in larger numbers, the reports increased. These newcomers, unfamiliar with the warnings, made easy prey. A fishing boat captain named Samuel Whitmore recorded an incident in his log dated April of 1912. He had anchored in a secluded bay to wait out a storm, and sometime after midnight, he heard what he described as a woman screaming for help from the shore. He prepared to launch his dinghy to investigate, but his Tlingit deckhand physically restrained him, insisting that no woman could be in that location, that the nearest settlement was 2 days away. They listened together as the screaming continued for nearly an hour, moving up and down the shoreline, sometimes close enough that Whitmore swore he could hear the individual words she was shouting. He wrote that the voice called his name. His deckhand told him he was lucky to be on a boat, lucky to have deep water between him and the shore. On land, the deckhand said, he would already be dead. These accounts followed a pattern. The voices always came from near water, the creeks and rivers and shorelines that otters favor. They called out in moments of isolation, when the victim was alone or separated from their group. And the voices always mimicked someone specific, someone the victim would rush to save without hesitation. Anthropologists who studied Tlingit culture in the mid-20th century often dismissed the Kushtaka legends as simple cautionary tales about the dangers of the wilderness. They theorized that the stories served a practical purpose, teaching children to be wary of predators and to avoid wandering away from camp. But the descendants of Tlingit communities push back against this interpretation with quiet insistence. When you speak to them about the Kushtaka, they do not use the past tense. They do not frame these beings as metaphorical or extinct. Margaret Sawyer, whose grandmother was a Tlingit elder from the Juneau area, describes the Kushtaka this way. They are not evil in the way humans understand evil. They are predatory, which is different. They exist in their own right, following their own nature. Her grandmother taught her that the Kushtaka were once human themselves, people who drowned or died of hypothermia near water and were transformed rather than allowed to pass on properly. They exist in a state of between, and they want company. They want to pull others into that same liminal space. The mimicry is not meant to deceive as much as to invite. They are calling you to join them in their transformation. The psychological dimension of these encounters cannot be overstated. Auditory hallucinations are well documented in extreme isolation. The human brain, starved for social input, will sometimes generate voices or music or conversations that do not exist. Hikers on long solo expeditions frequently report hearing their names called. Sailors on watch in the middle of the ocean describe hearing their shipmates talking, only to discover they are alone on deck. The explanation typically involves a combination of sleep deprivation, sensory monotony, and the brain's pattern recognition systems misfiring. But the Kushtaka encounters differ in their consistency and specificity. These are not vague murmurs or ambiguous sounds. Witnesses describe perfect replication of familiar voices, complete with emotional inflection and personal detail. They describe hearing their daughters laughing, their wives calling for help using their childhood nicknames, their fathers shouting warnings using phrases specific to their family history. The case from 1983 remains one of the most thoroughly documented modern encounters. Thomas Riggs worked as a maintenance supervisor at a salmon cannery on the southern coast of Alaska. He had lived in the state for nearly a decade, long enough to hear the stories but not long enough, perhaps, to take them as seriously as he should have. On an evening in late July, just after the dinner shift, Riggs was performing a routine check of the generator shed at the edge of the facility property. The shed sat perhaps 200 yards from the main buildings, positioned where the cleared ground met the dense spruce forest. Riggs heard his daughter Sarah calling him from the trees. Her voice was panicked, crying his name over and over. He later told investigators that he knew instantly something was wrong because Sarah had a distinctive way of saying "Dad" when she was frightened, a particular rising intonation on the single syllable. And this voice had it exactly right. He ran toward the sound without hesitation. He crashed through the underbrush, following the voice as it seemed to move deeper into the forest. He called back to Sarah, shouting that he was coming, that everything would be okay. The voice led him for what he estimated was 10 or 15 minutes, always staying just ahead of him, always crying out for help. Then, abruptly, he broke through a thicket and found himself standing at the edge of a steep ravine he had not known existed. A creek ran at the bottom, perhaps 30 feet below, the water dark and fast-moving. The voice called out one more time from somewhere across the ravine, and then it stopped. In the sudden silence, Riggs realized several things simultaneously. It was darker than it should be. He had run much farther than he thought. He had no idea which direction would lead him back to the cannery. And most importantly, his daughter Sarah was not in Alaska. She lived with his ex-wife in Seattle. She was in school, over 500 miles away, exactly where she was supposed to be on a Thursday afternoon. He made it back to the cannery facility after nearly 2 hours of stumbling through the woods. The crew had been preparing to organize a search party. When Riggs explained what happened, the older workers, particularly those who had Tlingit heritage or who had spent significant time in the region, nodded with a kind of grim recognition. They told him he was fortunate. They said the Kushtaka had almost had him. If he had tried to cross that ravine, if he had attempted to climb down to the creek, he would have fallen. And once he was in the water, injured and disoriented, the transformation would have begun. Riggs called his ex-wife that night. Sarah was fine. She had been at school all day. She had not called out to anyone. She had not been in any danger whatsoever. The terror of auditory mimicry operates on multiple levels. First, there's the immediate physical danger. The Kushtaka voices lure people away from safety, away from shelters and roads and other humans, into terrain where injury and hypothermia become likely outcomes. But beyond the physical threat lies something more existentially disturbing. Our voices are intimate identifiers. They carry our identity in ways that visual appearance sometimes cannot. We recognize the voices of our loved ones in the dark, through doors, across distances. That recognition bypasses our critical thinking. It connects directly to emotion and memory and trust. When something else uses that voice, when a non-human intelligence wears the auditory signature of someone you love, it violates a fundamental assumption about reality. It suggests that the markers we use to navigate the social world, the signals we trust without question, can be compromised. If you cannot trust your daughter's voice calling for help, what can you trust? If the sound that most clearly signals a loved one in distress might actually be a predator wearing an acoustic disguise, how do you respond appropriately to real emergency? The modern encounters continue. Park rangers in southeast Alaska receive multiple reports each year of hikers who heard voices calling them from off-trail. Some follow the voices. Most of these people are found eventually, cold and confused, sometimes with injuries consistent with falls or exposure. A few are never found at all. The Coast Guard has records of fishermen who radioed about hearing distress calls from empty lifeboats, from deserted islands, from locations where no other vessels were present. These men describe following the calls, driven by the maritime obligation to rescue anyone in trouble. only to find nothing but water and stone, and the sound of waves against the shore. The Tlingit descendants still teach their children about the Kushtaka. They explain that if you hear a voice in the wilderness, especially near water, you must stop and think before you respond. Ask yourself whether that person could truly be in this place. Look for other signs, footprints, or broken branches, or some physical evidence of human passage. Do not rush forward blindly, no matter how desperate the voice sounds, because the land otter men are patient. They have been here longer than the canneries, longer than the towns, longer than the roads that pretend to tame this landscape. They understand human weakness with predatory precision. They know that we will run toward the sound of our children crying. They know that we cannot help ourselves. And that, perhaps, is the deepest horror. Not that something is hunting us, but that it hunts us by exploiting our best instincts. The Kushtaka turn our love into bait, our compassion into a trap. They prove that in the wild places, in the spaces where human control gives way to older rules, the things that make us most human might also make us most vulnerable. The mountain air hung cold and still on the night of October 23, 2019, when Sarah Chen first heard her brother's voice calling from the darkness beyond their campsite. The problem was her brother Michael was sitting right next to her, staring into the flames of their campfire, his face draining of color as they both listened to his voice echoing through the Virginia wilderness, pleading for help. This wasn't folklore passed down through generations or a legend whispered around dying embers. This was documented, recorded, and witnessed by 7 people equipped with smartphones, digital cameras, and the certainty that what they were experiencing couldn't possibly be real. Yet the voice kept calling, perfect in its replication, down to the slight lisp Michael had developed after a childhood dental injury. The voice knew things. It used phrases only Michael used. It called Sarah by the nickname only family members knew. And it was leading them deeper into the woods, away from the safety of their tents and the rational world they thought they understood. The phenomenon locals have come to call the Crawlers represents something unprecedented in the catalog of Appalachian mysteries. These aren't the towering, hair-covered figures of Bigfoot lore, or the glowing eyes of folklore's traditional monsters. Witnesses describe something far more disturbing. Pale entities, humanoid in basic structure but wrong in ways that make the rational mind recoil. Too long in the limbs, too fluid in their movement. Skin described as almost translucent, like something that's never seen sunlight. Stretched over frames that seem to bend in ways human skeletons simply cannot accommodate. But it's not their appearance that's generating the surge of reports throughout Appalachia. It's what they can do with their voices. The ability to mimic, to replicate, to steal the vocal patterns of human beings with such precision that trained audio analysts are struggling to explain what their equipment is telling them. Dr. Marcus Webb, a forensic audio specialist at Virginia Commonwealth University, spent 3 weeks analyzing recordings from the Chen camping incident. His report, published in a Journal of Acoustic Research in late 2020, contained conclusions that clearly troubled him. The vocal patterns in the recordings matched Michael Chen's voice across 17 distinct markers that audio forensics typically use for voice identification. Pitch, cadence, rhythm, even the subtle breath patterns between words. But there were anomalies that made no physiological sense. The voice in the woods was producing frequencies outside the normal range of human vocal cords. The breath patterns suggested a lung capacity far beyond what Michael's medical records indicated. And in several instances, the recording captured what Webb described as a layering effect, as if multiple voices were speaking in perfect synchronization, creating the illusion of a single voice. What we're seeing in these recordings, Webb stated in his report, doesn't match any known vocal manipulation technology. The frequency variations and the overtone structures suggest a vocal mechanism fundamentally different from human anatomy, yet producing sounds nearly identical to a specific human subject. No. The Virginia incident wasn't an isolated event, though it became the most documented case due to the number of witnesses and the quality of the recordings obtained. Throughout Appalachia, from Georgia to Pennsylvania, reports following similar patterns have been increasing steadily since around 2015. The rise correlates almost perfectly with the proliferation of smartphones and personal recording devices, suggesting that these encounters may have been occurring for far longer than we realized, simply undocumented and dismissed as imagination or the tricks of darkness. James Holbrook, a cave explorer with over 30 years of experience mapping the extensive cave systems beneath the Appalachian Range, recalls when he first encountered something that didn't align with his understanding of acoustics and echo patterns. It was 2017, deep in an unmapped section of a cave system in eastern Kentucky. He was alone, marking his path according to protocols he'd followed hundreds of times before. The cave was silent except for the sound of his own breathing and the occasional drip of water from limestone formations overhead. Then he heard his own voice, calling back to him from deeper in the cave system. Not an echo, he insists. He knows echoes. He understands how sound behaves in confined spaces, how it bounces and distorts and fades. This was different. His voice was calling to him, telling him to come deeper, to follow the passage to the left, where the ceiling dropped low and the darkness became absolute. The voice was using his exact inflection, his accent, even the way he cleared his throat between sentences. Holbrook marked the cave entrance and left. He's never returned to that specific system, and he's encountered similar phenomena in 3 other cave networks since then. Each time his own voice, calling from places he hasn't yet explored. Other cavers have reported identical experiences. The community doesn't talk about it much, not officially, but in private conversations, away from the scientific organizations and the formal expedition logs, they share story. Voices that know things they shouldn't. Echoes that don't obey the laws of physics. Sounds that seem designed to lure explorers deeper into places where the rock closes in and the way back becomes uncertain. The psychological impact of hearing your own voice used against you runs deeper than almost any other form of fear. We trust our own voices. We trust the voices of people we love. These are the sounds that mean safety, that mean home, that mean connection with other human beings. When that trust is weaponized, when those familiar sounds become tools of deception, it strikes at something fundamental in our psychology. Dr. Ellen Vasquez, a psychologist specializing in trauma response, has interviewed over 40 individuals who claim to have experienced encounters with these entities. Her findings paint a disturbing picture. The common thread, she explains, is a profound sense of violation. It's not just fear of a predator or a dangerous animal. It's the feeling that something has reached into their most intimate relationships and stolen something precious. Multiple witnesses have described it as a form of psychological assault, hearing their loved ones' voices used as bait. The trauma is compounded by the gaslighting effect. When someone reports that they heard their wife calling for help from the woods, but their wife was standing right beside them, the natural response from others is skepticism. It sounds like a hallucination, a trick of the mind, an auditory illusion created by stress or fear or the power of suggestion. But when 7 people hear the same voice, when recordings capture audio that shouldn't exist, the dismissals become harder to maintain. The 2019 Virginia incident lasted nearly 4 hours. The Chen camping group, 7 people ranging in age from 22 to 38, all college educated, all equipped with modern technology, found themselves led in an expanding spiral through the forest. The voice calling Michael's name would seem to come from one direction. They would move toward it, following the sound. Then it would shift, calling from behind them, or from the left, or from a direction that seemed impossible given where they just heard it. Sarah Chen's recording, captured on her phone throughout much of the ordeal, reveals the group's progression from confusion to fear to something approaching panic. Her timestamp shows they began following the voice at 10:47 p.m. By 11:30, they'd realized they were lost. Their GPS units, which should have easily guided them back to their campsite, were showing their location, but the terrain didn't match what the devices claimed. Trees were in places the satellite imagery showed as clear ground. Rock formations appeared that weren't on any map. At 12:15 a.m., according to the recording, they caught their first glimpse of what was calling to them. Sarah's video shows only darkness, and the flashlights of the group cutting through the trees, but the audio captures the moment clearly. Someone screams. Multiple people start talking at once, and Michael's voice, the real Michael standing with the group, says very clearly, That's not possible. That's my face. The video never captured a clear image. Whatever they saw moved too quickly, staying just at the edge of the light, but all 7 witnesses later described the same thing under separate interviews. A pale figure, roughly human in shape but wrong in proportion. Arms too long, fingers too many. A face that seemed to be attempting human features, but failing, like a sculpture made by someone who'd only heard human beings described but never seen one. And worst of all, when the flashlights caught it for those brief seconds, it was moving its mouth in perfect sync with Michael's voice, still calling, still pleading for help, even as the real Michael stood frozen in horror. They made it back to their campsite at 3:40 a.m. The GPS started working correctly again when they were within half a mile of their tents. The voice stopped abruptly when they reached the clearing where they'd camped. No fade out, no echo, just an immediate silence that felt almost as threatening as the calling had been. Researchers studying these reports have noted a disturbing pattern in the frequency and sophistication of encounters. Earlier reports, from the 1990s and early 2000s, typically described simpler mimicry. A voice calling from the woods, yes, but generic phrases. Help me, come here. Basic lures that could work on anyone. The more recent reports show something different. The voices are using specific information. Pet names, inside jokes, references to conversations that only family members or close friends would know. Some researchers believe we're witnessing a learning process, that these entities, whatever they are adapting to human presence in their territory. They're refining their techniques based on what works. The proliferation of human voices, carried on the wind, broadcast through speakers, recorded on devices, and played back, might be providing them with more material to work with, more samples to study and replicate. Thomas Brennan, a wildlife biologist who's shifted his focus to documenting these encounters, suggests we might be dealing with a form of evolved mimicry, far beyond anything known in the natural world. Look at lyrebirds, he says. They can replicate chainsaws, car alarms, camera shutters. Look at parrots, myna birds, mockingbirds. Vocal mimicry exists throughout nature. But this is something operating on a completely different level. This is mimicry with intention, with purpose, with what appears to be tactical application. The cave systems present their own particular horror. In the enclosed spaces beneath the mountains, where darkness is absolute and sound behaves in strange ways, the reports take on an even more unsettling character. Cavers describe voices coming from passages that dead-end within yards. They describe hearing conversations they had hours earlier, played back to them with perfect accuracy. They describe their names being called by people who aren't on the expedition, who are sometimes hundreds of miles away, safely above ground. The Mammoth Cave system in Kentucky has produced enough reports that certain sections are informally avoided by experienced cavers. There's no official warning, no posted signs, but the community knows. The southeastern passages, where the cave narrows and descends into a network of crawlways barely wide enough for a human body, have generated consistent reports of voice phenomena since at least 2012. Rachel Kim, who explored those passages in 2018, recorded audio throughout her expedition. Her recordings captured her own voice, apparently coming from ahead of her in the passage, describing cave formations she hadn't yet reached. The voice was describing them accurately. When she reached those sections, they matched the description her own voice had given minutes earlier. She extracted from the cave system and has not returned to those passages, though she continues to explore other cave networks. The question that haunts researchers is what these entities want. The voices seem designed to lure, to lead people away from safety, to draw them deeper into isolated areas. But to what end? The vast majority of people who experience these encounters survive. They're frightened, traumatized, disoriented, but physically unharmed. There are exceptions, of course. There are missing persons cases throughout Appalachia that might take on new significance when viewed through this lens. But if these entities are predatory, they're remarkably inefficient predators. Some researchers propose a territorial explanation. The voices are a defense mechanism designed to confuse and repel human intrusion into specific areas. Others suggest we're dealing with something more complex, an intelligence testing boundaries, learning about the humans increasingly encroaching on wilderness space. The fact that the phenomena seem to be increasing with human presence, rather than decreasing, supports the latter theory. What remains undeniable is that something is happening in these mountains and caves. Multiple witnesses, audio recordings, video footage that shows nothing but captures sounds that shouldn't exist. The technology that was supposed to help us document and understand the world around us is instead confirming that some aspects of that world resist our understanding completely. Every smartphone recording, every audio analysis, every witness testimony adds to a picture that becomes more disturbing the clearer it becomes. We are not alone in these ancient mountains, and whatever shares this space with us has learned to speak with our voices, to call us with our own words, to lead us into darkness using the sounds we trust most. There are things that live in the deep wilderness that know us too well. Not our names or our faces necessarily, but something more fundamental. They understand the architecture of human form, the rhythm of human speech, the subtle choreography of how we move through space. And in that understanding lies a horror more profound than any monster with fangs or claws could ever achieve. The hunting party left Bozeman, Montana in early October of 2014. 6 friends who had made this annual trip for nearly a decade. They knew the backcountry of the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness like the rooms of their own homes. They had names for certain clearings, inside jokes about particular trails, the kind of familiarity that breeds comfort, maybe too much comfort. By the 3rd day, they had set up camp in a bowl valley they had used before, ringed by lodgepole pines, with a creek running cold and clear along the eastern edge. Mark Hutchins went to gather firewood just before dusk. He told the others he would stay close, maybe 200 yards out, following the creek north where deadfall was plentiful. The October light was fading fast, turning everything golden then gray. He had been gone perhaps 20 minutes when they saw him again. He emerged from the tree line to the west, not the north where he had gone. This was the first strange thing, but not strange enough to alarm anyone immediately. Maybe he had looped around. Maybe he had changed his mind about direction. He was carrying an armful of wood, and he was walking toward camp with what seemed like purpose. But Travis Yolen, who had known Mark since high school, felt something tighten in his chest as he watched his friend approach. Later, when he tried to explain it to the Forest Service investigator, he struggled to articulate exactly what was wrong. Mark looked like Mark. Same height, same build, same faded red jacket and ball-capped eye. Same beard, same walk, almost the same walk. The thing that looked like Mark Hutchins moved through the clearing with joints that bent just slightly wrong. Not grotesquely, not obviously. The knee joint seemed to hinge backward for just a fraction of a second with each step. The elbow swung at an angle that was off by maybe 5 degrees. If you were not paying attention, if you were focused on his face or distracted by conversation, you would miss it entirely. But Travis was paying attention, and he could not look away. The Mark thing reached the edge of camp, about 30 feet from the fire. It stopped. Its mouth opened and sound came out, but the sound arrived just a beat too late, like a film with desynchronized audio. "Got the wood," it said, and the words hung in the air with an emptiness that made Travis's skin crawl. The voice was Mark's voice, the exact timbre and accent, but it came from the mouth a half second after the lips had moved. Another one of the group, Dennis Park, stood up from where he had been tending the fire. "Mark, you okay?" he asked. The thing that looked like Mark turned its head to look at Dennis, and the movement was smooth, too smooth, the neck rotating without the small compensatory movements that human bodies make unconsciously. "I'm fine," it said with that same delayed audio, that same hollow quality. "Just fine. Wait or one." And then the real Mark Hutchins came crashing through the brush from the north, his arms full of firewood, breathing hard. "Holy hell, boys, I think I just saw a cat. Big one, maybe 100 yards back, up in the rocks." "No." The thing by the fire did not react to this. It stood perfectly still, arms at its sides, wood scattered at its feet. Later, none of them could agree on how long this tableau lasted. Travis thought maybe 10 seconds. Dennis thought it was closer to a minute. Time stretched and warped in that moment, the way it does when the brain encounters something it cannot process. The real Mark saw his duplicate and stopped walking. His face went pale, then red, then pale again, The duplicate turned its head, that same unnaturally smooth rotation, and looked at him. For a moment, the two marks stared at each other across the camp. Then the duplicate's mouth opened very wide, wider than a human mouth should open, and it turned and walked back into the trees. Each backwards bending knee, joint clearly visible now, no longer even attempting to hide the wrongness. They broke camp in less than 15 minutes, abandoning food and gear, hiking out by headlamp and moonlight. They reported the incident to the Forest Service the next morning. The ranger who took their report, a woman named Sarah Klein with 16 years of backcountry experience, did not seem surprised. She made detailed notes, asked specific questions about the duplicate's movement and speech patterns, and then she told them something that made the hair on their necks stand up all over again. This was not the first report, not even the first that month. In the years since, the term fleshgait has emerged from the darker corners of internet forums and creepypasta sites to describe these entities. The word itself is new, but the concept is ancient. Things that wear human shape, but are not human. Things that understand our form well enough to replicate it, but not quite perfectly. The reports cluster around national parks and wilderness areas, places where people venture far from civilization, and sometimes encounter things that civilization has pushed to the margins. A family hiking in Olympic National Park in 2016 reported seeing the mother of the group emerge from a restroom facility at a trailhead, walk past them without acknowledgement, and continue down the trail. 30 seconds later, the real mother emerged from the restroom, asking if they were ready to go. The duplicate was gone, but two hikers further down the trail later reported passing a woman, matching her description, who walked with a strange shuffling gait and whose face seemed blurred, as if seen through frosted glass. In Yellowstone, in 2018, a park ranger documented an incident where 3 separate visitors reported seeing the same elderly man in different locations across the park within the span of an hour, distances that would have required superhuman speed to traverse. Each witness described the man identically: khaki pants, white polo shirt, brimmed hat, but each also noted something wrong. One said his eyes did not blink. Another said his smile was too wide and showed too many teeth. The third said he moved without making any sound, not even the crunch of gravel under his shoes. Rangers in several national parks have developed unofficial protocols for dealing with these reports. If someone in your party walks away and returns acting strangely, you ask them a question only they would know the answer to. If you hear your name called from the woods, you do not answer. If you see someone who looks like a member of your group in a location they should not be, you verify the location of the real person before approaching the duplicate. These rules are not written in any official manual, but they are passed down from experienced rangers to new recruits in quiet conversations, in the same way that soldiers share superstitions and sailors trade warnings. The terror of the fleshgait lies in its nearness to human. Our brains are exquisitely tuned to recognize faces, to read emotion in the subtle movements of facial muscles, to detect authenticity in voice and gesture. We are social animals, and our survival has always depended on our ability to distinguish friend from foe, trustworthy from deceptive. When something presents itself as human, but triggers all our subconscious alarm systems, the psychological effect is devastating. This is the uncanny valley, a concept first articulated by Japanese roboticist Masahiro Mori in 1970. As robots or animated characters become more human-like, our empathy and comfort with them increases, but only up to a point. When they become almost but not quite human, when they look nearly right, but something is subtly wrong, our response flips from empathy to revulsion. That gap, that valley between almost human and truly human, is a place of profound unease. The fleshgait lives in that valley. It knows the shape of us, the sound of us, maybe even the smell of us. But it does not know the soul of us, the ineffable quality that makes movement organic and speech authentic. The knee that bends backward, the smile that is too wide, the voice that arrives too late. These are the tells, the small failures in an otherwise perfect disguise. Some researchers suggest these experiences might be explained by psychological phenomena. The stress of wilderness isolation, they say, can produce hallucinations or misperceptions. The brain, exhausted and hyper-alert, might misinterpret normal movements as abnormal, might create delays and distortions where none exist. This is possible. This is rational. But it does not explain the consistency of the reports, the specific details that repeat across hundreds of accounts from people who have never met and never read each other's stories. Others point to the possibility of unknown primates, creatures that have evolved to mimic human appearance as a survival strategy or hunting technique. The forests of North America are vast, and new species are discovered regularly. Could something be out there? Something that has learned to wear our shape the way an insect wears the colors of a flower? The idea is fantastical but not impossible. And then there are those who believe the fleshgaits are something else entirely. Something older than forests, older than humanity itself. Entities that existed before us and learned our shape when we entered their territories. Things that see us as we see mannequins or puppets, understanding the form but not the essence. These believers point to indigenous legends from cultures around the world. Stories of skinwalkers and doppelgangers and fetch creatures that predate modern sightings by thousands of years. What we know for certain is that people continue to report these encounters. Park rangers continue to document them. And those who have seen a fleshgait, who have looked into the face of something wearing a friend's features with just that hint of wrongness, are changed by the experience. They become cautious in the wilderness, in ways they were not before. They listen differently to voices in the dark. They look more carefully at faces, searching for the tells, the small betrayals of the inhuman behind the human mask. The Montana hunting party never went back to that valley in the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness. Mark Hutchins sold his rifle and gear the following spring. He does not talk about what happened, not anymore. But those who know him say he sometimes stops mid-sentence, mid-gesture, and becomes very still, as if he is listening for something. As if he is checking his own movements, making sure his joints bend the right way, making sure his words arrive when his lips move. Making sure he is still himself and not something wearing himself like a coat. Because that is the deepest horror of the fleshgait. Not just that it looks like us, but the creeping fear it plants in our minds. The question that comes in quiet moments, in the space between sleep and waking. How do we know we are still ourselves? How do we know something has not learned to be us so perfectly that even we cannot tell the difference? The fleshgait holds up a mirror, and in that reflection, we see ourselves as we might appear to something utterly alien. A collection of movements and sounds and shapes that can be studied, cataloged, and reproduced. Almost perfectly. But not quite. Never quite. And thank God for that. Thank God for the wrongness, the delays, the joints that bend backward. Because those imperfections are the only things standing between us and a world where we can no longer trust the evidence of our own eyes, where every familiar face might hide something wearing it like a mask, waiting in the uncanny valley, with a smile that is just a little too wide. The trail camera activated at 3:47 in the morning on October 9th, 2021. Motion sensors triggered the device mounted to an oak tree along the Appalachian Trail, roughly 8 miles from Gatlinburg, Tennessee. What it captured would circulate through online forums for months afterward, accumulating thousands of comments from people who felt something fundamentally wrong when viewing the footage, even if they couldn't articulate exactly what disturbed them so deeply. The image shows what appears to be a white-tailed deer. It stands in the characteristic pose of the species, positioned broadside to the camera. The coat displays the proper coloration, russet brown fading to white at the underbelly. The body proportions seem correct. 4 legs, a tail, the general morphology matching Odocoileus virginianus perfectly. But the deer stands completely vertical, balanced on its hind legs like a human being. Its front hooves dangle uselessly at its sides, and its head faces the camera directly, neck twisted at an angle no deer anatomy should allow, staring into the lens with an intensity that seems to transcend animal curiosity. The eyes reflect the infrared flash with that familiar eyeshine common to nocturnal animals, but they face forward. Predator eyes. Not the wide-set lateral placement of prey species that need panoramic vision to detect threats, but the binocular forward focus of something that hunts. The creature remained in this position for 17 consecutive frames spanning nearly 4 minutes, according to the timestamp, utterly motionless, except for what witnesses describe as an almost imperceptible swaying, like something trying very hard to remember how to stand still, how to imitate the frozen posture of a startled deer. This phenomenon has acquired a name in the vast catalog of internet cryptozoology. They call them not deer. The terminology emerged from Appalachian communities first, whispered stories exchanged in towns where the mountains press close and the forests grow thick enough to hide nearly anything. The name captures something essential about the encounters. These aren't simply unusual deer or misidentified animals. They register immediately in human perception as wrong, as something wearing deer shape like an ill-fitting disguise. The reports follow consistent patterns. Witnesses describe deer moving with joints that bend incorrectly, legs articulating in ways that suggest additional joints, or bones that flex in the wrong direction. They describe deer that walk with an odd shuffling gait, dragging their hooves instead of the light-footed precision herbivores require for survival. Some accounts mention deer standing motionless beside highways for hours, watching traffic pass with what observers describe as calculated interest rather than the skittish wariness normal deer display near roads. One recurring detail appears in testimony after testimony. The eyes. Always the eyes face forward, tracking human movement with predatory focus. Hunters accustomed to reading animal behavior describe feeling watched, feeling assessed in a way that triggers some ancient warning system in the human brain. Several experienced outdoorsmen report the same visceral reaction, a sudden conviction that they had become prey, that something behind those forward-facing eyes was evaluating them as food. To understand what we might be confronting, we need to examine the concept of mimicry in evolutionary biology. Nature has produced countless examples of organisms that survive by imitating other species. The viceroy butterfly mimics the toxic monarch to avoid predation. Harmless snakes evolve coloration identical to venomous coral snakes. These represent Batesian mimicry, where a harmless species adopts the warning signals of a dangerous one. But aggressive mimicry presents something far more unsettling. This describes predators that imitate harmless creatures to access prey. The anglerfish dangles a lure that mimics a small fish, drawing curious prey directly into its jaws. The zone-tailed hawk resembles a turkey vulture in flight, allowing it to approach prey animals that have learned vultures pose no threat. The alligator snapping turtle produces a small pink appendage in its mouth that writhes like a worm, luring fish close enough to snap. Dr. Sarah Chen, an evolutionary biologist at Cornell University specializing in predator-prey dynamics, offers a theoretical framework for understanding mimicry cryptids. She proposes that if an unknown predator species evolved in close proximity to humans over thousands of years, aggressive mimicry would represent a highly effective hunting strategy. Humans have learned to categorize animals rapidly based on visual recognition patterns. We identify deer as harmless herbivores within milliseconds of perception. That immediate categorization affects our behavior. We don't run from deer. We might approach them for photographs. We certainly don't treat them as threats requiring defensive measures. An organism that could exploit this recognition system would possess enormous advantages. Dr. Chen points to the uncanny valley phenomenon as evidence that human brains contain sophisticated systems for detecting imitation. We respond with intense discomfort to things that appear almost but not quite human, nearly but not exactly correct. This suggests our ancestors encountered something that benefited from wearing human or human-adjacent forms, something dangerous enough that evolution hardwired us to detect and fear imperfect mimicry. Consider what an apex predator adapted to hunt humans might look like. It would need to access human settlements, penetrate our defenses, overcome our wariness of genuine predators. It couldn't resemble a bear or wolf, creatures we've learned to fear and avoid. It would benefit from appearing harmless, familiar, categorizable as something we've learned doesn't threaten us. It might imitate deer, wandering suburban neighborhoods without triggering alarm. It might imitate dogs, approaching hikers on trails. It might even imitate other humans, standing at the edge of campfire light, half visible in darkness, waiting to be invited closer. The Smoky Mountains incident provides compelling documentation of this possibility. The hiker who owned the trail camera, a man named Marcus Webb, who requested his location remain undisclosed for safety reasons, retrieved the camera after a weekend backpacking trip. He regularly used trail cameras to document wildlife, and had accumulated thousands of ordinary images over the years. Black bears, wild turkeys, deer, coyotes, the usual fauna of the southern Appalachian. But when he reviewed the October footage, he found 17 frames that made him immediately pack his equipment and hike out in darkness, despite having planned to camp another night. Marcus described his reaction in an interview posted to a Cryptozoology forum. He said the images triggered a panic response he'd never experienced in 20 years of wilderness camping. His hands shook loading the camera data. His vision narrowed. His heart rate spiked. His body understood danger before his conscious mind processed the specific wrongness of what the camera captured. He drove 3 hours back to Knoxville that night and didn't return to that section of trail for months. The forensic analysis proved inconclusive, but disturbing. Wildlife experts confirmed the creature displayed anatomical features inconsistent with white-tailed deer. The leg proportions didn't match. The way the cervical vertebrae must be positioned to achieve that head angle would require bone structure deer simply don't possess. One zoologist noted that the stance would require the creature's center of gravity to shift in ways that should make standing upright impossible without a completely different skeletal configuration. Yet, there it stood, balanced, still, watching. The predatory adaptation theory suggests these creatures possess intelligence sufficient to understand what trail cameras are, what they represent. The direct stare into the lens implies awareness of being photographed, perhaps even a deliberate choice to reveal themselves. Some researchers propose this represents a threat display, a way of marking territory or warning humans away from hunting grounds. Others suggest something more disturbing, that these images function as lures themselves, drawing curious humans deeper into remote areas seeking their own documentation, their own proof. Pattern recognition represents one of humanity's most fundamental survival tools. We identify edible plants, dangerous animals, safe shelter, and potential threats through rapid pattern matching against templates stored in memory. This cognitive system enabled our ancestors to navigate complex environments and make split-second decisions that determined survival. But every system contains vulnerabilities, exploitable weaknesses that evolution tests continuously. What happens when something learns to hack that system? When a predator evolves to trigger all the recognition patterns of harmless familiar animals while remaining fundamentally other, fundamentally predatory. The report suggests these encounters produce profound psychological distress, even in experienced outdoorsmen. Witnesses describe feeling as though their perception had glitched, as though reality itself contained an error. The cognitive dissonance between what they see and what their pattern recognition insists they should be seeing creates a kind of mental vertigo. The not deer phenomenon extends beyond the Smokies. Reports emerge from Appalachia, the Pacific Northwest, the forests of New England, anywhere large predators might persist undocumented. The descriptions vary in specifics, but maintain consistent core elements. Something that looks like prey but moves like a predator. Something that understands enough about human behavior to exploit our assumptions. Something patient enough to stand motionless for minutes or hours, waiting with the calculated stillness of spiders in webs. Marcus Webb's final statement in his forum post carries particular weight. He writes that he's hunted and camped his entire adult life, that he's encountered bears at close range, stumbled across mountain lion kills, still warm, heard coyotes circling his tent at night. None of those experiences frightened him the way those 17 frames did, because the known predators behave predictably. They follow ecological rules, occupying their niche in comprehensible ways. But what he captured on camera represented something that shouldn't exist, something that violated the fundamental categories humans use to navigate the natural world. He ended with a question that researchers still debate. If these creatures exist, if aggressive mimicry has produced something capable of wearing familiar shapes to access human prey, what else might be hiding in plain sight? What other animals that seem slightly wrong, that move incorrectly, that watch us with the wrong kind of eyes, might represent something far more dangerous than misidentified wildlife or evolutionary oddities? The trail camera remains mounted in those Tennessee woods, still capturing images every night. Marcus checks the footage remotely now, unwilling to return in person. Most nights show ordinary wildlife, following ordinary patterns. But several times each year, something appears that stands wrong, moves wrong. watches the camera with forward-facing predator eyes. And each time, Marcus downloads the footage, adds it to his growing archive of evidence, and wonders what exactly is studying him back. The old iron bridge stands in the darkness, northwest of Denton, Texas. Its rusted frame, spanning Hickory Creek like the skeletal remains of some forgotten age. Built in 1910, the structure served travelers for decades before being retired from active use, left to decay slowly beneath the sprawling oaks and tangled undergrowth. But the bridge never truly emptied. Something remained. Something that has learned over the years to speak with borrowed voices. They call it Goatman's Bridge now, a name that carries the weight of legend and the echo of screams heard too many times to dismiss. The stories say that in 1938, a black goat farmer named Oscar Washburn settled near the bridge, achieving modest success in a time and place where such accomplishment was viewed by some as intolerable. He hung a sign from the bridge declaring himself the Goatman, and for this pride, for this simple assertion of existence, local clansmen came in the night. They dragged him from his home, placed a noose around his neck, and threw him from the bridge into the creek below. But when they looked down, they found the noose empty. His body vanished into the dark water. Enraged and terrified, the men returned to his home and murdered his entire family. Whether Oscar Washburn existed exactly as the legend describes remains debated by historians. But what cannot be disputed is that something profoundly wrong took root at that bridge. Something that has grown hungrier and more sophisticated with each passing decade. For years, the encounters followed predictable patterns. Visitors reported feelings of being watched, phantom footsteps on the bridge deck, the occasional glimpse of glowing eyes in the tree line. Standard haunting fare, unnerving but manageable. Then, sometime in the late 1990s, the phenomenon evolved. People began reporting voices calling to them from beneath the bridge, voices that sounded disturbingly familiar. A teenager would hear his mother calling his name, only to remember she was miles away at home. A couple would hear their daughter's voice begging for help from the creek bed, though their daughter was safely in another state. The entity, whatever it was, had learned a new trick. It had learned to mimic. By the 2000s, Old Alton Bridge had become a pilgrimage site for paranormal investigators, thrill seekers, and the morbidly curious. Most came expecting atmosphere and legend. What they found was something that interacted with them, studied them, and turned their own identities into weapons against them. The accounts that emerged from these visits share a disturbing consistency. Groups would spread out across the bridge and surrounding area, maintaining communication through cell phones or two-way radios. Then someone would hear their name called in a friend's voice, coming from a direction that made no sense. They would follow the sound, drawn by concern or curiosity, only to discover their friend was nowhere near that location. The voice would call again, deeper into the woods, leading them away from safety and into the suffocating darkness beneath the bridge. In 2012, a group of 4 college students from the University of North Texas drove out to the bridge on a Friday night in October, armed with flashlights and the kind of courage that comes from not yet understanding what real fear feels like. They parked near the bridge and walked onto its creaking deck, their footsteps echoing hollow in the night. According to their testimony given later to local paranormal researchers, they spent about 20 minutes on the bridge itself without incident, taking photographs and calling out the typical questions ghost hunters ask. Then Jennifer, one of the group, heard her boyfriend Marcus calling her name from the woods on the north side of the bridge. She turned and shouted back to him, asking what he wanted. His voice came again, urgent now, telling her he had found something she needed to see. She was about to climb down the embankment when her roommate grabbed her arm and pointed. Marcus was standing on the bridge behind them, had been there the entire time, looking at his phone. He had not called out. He had not spoken at all. Jennifer described the moment of realization as reality tilting, as every assumption about how the world worked suddenly coming into question. If Marcus was on the bridge, what had been calling her into the woods with his voice? The group left immediately, but not before hearing 2 more voices in the darkness below, one sounding like Jennifer's roommate, the other sounding like Marcus himself, both calling them to come down, to not leave yet, to stay and see what was waiting. They ran to their car and drove away, and none of them have returned to the bridge since. But their story, shared on local forums and paranormal websites, became part of the growing documentation that something, at Old Alton Bridge, was not just mimicking sounds randomly, but was actively hunting, using the voices of the living to separate and isolate potential victims. The most documented and disturbing case occurred in late 2016, when a semi-professional paranormal investigation team, called the Denton County Research Group, conducted a systematic overnight investigation of the site. The team consisted of 5 members, all equipped with body cameras, audio recorders, and handheld radios. They arrived at sunset and established a base camp with a camera monitoring station, showing live feeds from all 5 body cameras on a split screen. This setup would prove critical to understanding what happened next. The investigation began normally, with the team spreading out in assigned zones while maintaining radio contact. Around 11:30 that night, team member David, stationed on the east end of the bridge, radioed that he heard team leader Rachel calling him from the creek bed below. He asked her over the radio why she was down there and if she needed assistance. Rachel, who was on the west end of the bridge, responded with confusion, stating she had not called out and had not moved from her position. The person monitoring the camera feeds confirmed that all team members were visible in their assigned locations. No one was in the creek bed. Yet David insisted he could still hear Rachel's voice calling him, asking him to come help her with something. The voice was clear enough that his body camera microphone picked it up, and the audio analysis conducted later would show that the voice patterns, pitch, and cadence were a nearly perfect match for Rachel's speech patterns. Over the next hour, the phenomenon escalated dramatically. 3 different team members reported hearing other team members' voices, calling them from locations where those people demonstrably were not. The person monitoring the cameras began calling out in real time when someone reported hearing a voice, confirming positions, and creating a permanent record that the mimicry was impossible. At one point, 2 team members, Sarah and Mike, both heard each other calling for help from opposite directions beneath the bridge. Sarah heard Mike's voice to the north. Mike heard Sarah's voice to the south. Both voices were begging for help, saying they had fallen and were injured. The camera monitor confirmed that both Sarah and Mike were standing on the bridge deck, clearly visible, neither having moved. Yet their body camera audio captured the voices calling them, and those voices matched their own vocal signatures. The breaking point came at approximately 1:15 in the morning. Rachel, the team leader, made the decision to call off the investigation and return to base camp. As the team gathered their equipment, David's body camera captured something that would become the most analyzed piece of paranormal evidence from the site. While the team stood together near their vehicles, clearly visible and accounted for, his camera microphone recorded all 5 team members' voices coming from beneath the bridge, calling in unison, repeating the same phrase over and over in perfect synchronization. Come back. Come back. Come back. The audio is available online, and it remains one of the most chilling pieces of evidence in modern paranormal investigation. 5 voices, perfectly mimicking 5 people who were standing together in silence, all emanating from the darkness below the bridge where nothing physical existed. But even this investigation, as thoroughly documented as it was, pales in comparison to the raw terror of closer, more personal encounters. In the spring of 2017, a woman named Amanda drove to the bridge with her boyfriend Kyle on a warm April evening. They were not paranormal enthusiasts or thrill seekers. Amanda had grown up near Denton and wanted to show Kyle the bridge as a piece of local history. They parked and walked out onto the structure as the sun set, talking about the legends but not taking them particularly seriously. As darkness settled, they decided to head back to the car. That is when Amanda heard Kyle's voice calling her from the woods beneath the bridge. The voice was urgent, almost panicked, saying her name again and again, telling her to come quickly, that he needed her help right now. She turned toward the sound, her heart already racing with concern, and was about to rush toward the embankment when she felt a hand on her shoulder. Kyle was directly behind her, close enough to touch, his face pale in the dim light. He had not called out. He had not moved. His lips had not moved. Yet his voice continued to call from the woods below, growing more insistent, more demanding. The tone shifting from panic to something harder to define, something that sounded like hunger. Amanda describes what happened next as the most visceral fear she has ever experienced. The voice that sounded exactly like her boyfriend's began to change in subtle ways, the words stretching slightly, the pitch wavering in ways that human vocal cords do not quite manage. It was as if whatever was producing the sound was losing its grip on the imitation, or perhaps no longer saw the need to maintain the illusion perfectly. The voice called her name, one final time. And in that final call, Amanda heard something underneath the familiar tone. Something ancient and cold, and absolutely malevolent. She and Kyle ran to their car and left, and Amanda has stated in multiple interviews that she will never return to that bridge, not for any reason. Not if her life depended on it. What makes the old Alton Bridge phenomenon particularly terrifying is its apparent intelligence and adaptability. This is not residual energy replaying past events. This is not random audio phenomena that humans interpret as voices. This is something that observes, that learns, that understands group dynamics, and uses that understanding to isolate and manipulate. The entity knows that humans respond to familiar voices, that we are hardwired to react when someone we know calls for help. It exploits our social bonds, weaponizes our love and concern, turns our relationships into traps. And it is getting better at this with each passing year. Local paranormal researchers who have studied the site extensively note that the mimicry has become more sophisticated over time. Early reports from the 1990s describe voices that sounded somewhat like people visitors knew. Recent reports describe perfect replications, down to specific speech patterns, nicknames, and inside references that only close friends or family would know. Some researchers theorize that the entity feeds on fear or emotional energy and has refined its technique to maximize terror. Others suggest something darker, that the entity is collecting information, building a library of voices and personalities for purposes we cannot yet understand. The bridge stands tonight as it has for over a century, rusted and decaying, officially closed but never truly empty. The entity that haunts it continues its dark work, calling out to visitors in stolen voices, learning, adapting, hunting. And somewhere in the darkness beneath that iron frame, in the space between the living world and whatever lies beyond, something waits with infinite patience, ready to speak to you in the voice of someone you love, ready to call you away from safety and into the woods where no one will hear you scream. Because by then, it will be using your voice too, calling the next visitor, adding your stolen sound to its growing collection. Proof that at Goatman's Bridge, the dead have learned to speak, and they have nothing kind to say. There is a pattern here that we cannot ignore. Across every continent, spanning thousands of years, separated by oceans and mountains and vast stretches of time, human beings have told the same story. Something out there calls to us in voices we know. Something mimics the people we love. And it's been happening for far longer than we can explain. Think about that for a moment. Cultures with no contact, no shared language, no way of communicating their fears to one another, all developed the same warnings. The Navajo told their children never to answer a voice calling from outside at night. The Norse warned of creatures that could steal your voice and use it against your family. In the Philippines, they speak of the aswang that mimics loved ones perfectly. In Appalachia, grandmothers still tell their grandchildren to ignore voices in the woods, even if they sound like mother calling them home. In Japan, the legends speak of things that copy human forms so precisely that only the smallest detail gives them away. This isn't coincidence. This is pattern recognition on a scale that should make us deeply uncomfortable. These aren't just campfire stories or superstitions born from ignorance. These are warnings, passed down through generations, written in blood and loss and the disappearance of people who answered when they shouldn't have. And here's what keeps researchers awake at night. The reports haven't stopped. They've continued, unbroken, from ancient times to the present day. We live in an age of science and rationality, where we can explain so much of what once terrified us. We understand thunder and lightning. We've mapped the human genome. We've sent machines to other planets. And yet, people still report hearing their names called in voices they recognize, only to discover that the person who called them was never there. They still encounter family members in places they shouldn't be, behaving in ways that are almost right, but not quite. They still hear their children crying from empty rooms, their spouses calling from the woods, their parents knocking on doors in the middle of the night, even though those people are asleep in bed or living 1,000 miles away. The modern cases are perhaps the most disturbing, because they come with evidence. We have audio recordings now. We have multiple witnesses with cell phones. We have timestamped data and security footage. And none of it makes sense according to what we think we know about reality. Consider the audio evidence alone. People have recorded voices calling to them from empty spaces. These aren't vague sounds that could be mistaken for words. They're clear, distinct voices speaking names, using inflections and speech patterns specific to individual people. Audio analysis shows they're not recordings being played back. They're not AI generated, at least not by any technology we've created. They exist in physical space, creating sound waves that microphones can capture, and yet the source of those sounds cannot be identified. Then there are the cases with multiple witnesses. An entire family hears Dad calling from the basement. They all rush down to help him. He's not there. They call his cell phone and he answers from his office 20 miles away, confused about why they're all calling him. He's been in a meeting for the past 2 hours. Or a group of hikers all see and hear one of their friends ahead on the trail. They watch him wave and call to them. They follow, trying to catch up. Then their friend appears behind them, out of breath from trying to catch up himself. He's been behind them the whole time. So what were they following? These cases involve sane, credible witnesses. Park rangers, police officers, teachers, doctors, people with no history of mental illness, no drug use, no reason to fabricate. And they all describe the same basic experience. Something that seemed real, that looked and sounded real, that mimicked someone they knew with impossible accuracy, but wasn't real at all. The question that haunts every serious researcher who examines this phenomenon: are we looking at separate, unrelated occurrences, or are we seeing evidence of one intelligence that has learned to mimic us? One entity, or species, or force that has existed alongside humanity throughout our entire history, studying us, learning our voices, perfecting its imitation of what we are. If these are separate incidents, separate entities, that presents its own terrifying implication. It would mean that mimicry of this kind is a common occurrence, something multiple different phenomena have developed independently. But if it's one thing, one intelligence that has been with us from the beginning, then we're faced with something that has had thousands of years to perfect its craft. Something that knows us better than we know ourselves. And why mimicry specifically? Why voices and familiar forms? Why doesn't it present itself honestly, whatever it is? The answer might be simple and horrible, because mimicry works. It gets us to respond, to approach, to trust, to follow. Our brains are wired to respond to the voices of our loved ones. When we hear our child crying, we run toward the sound. We don't stop to verify. We don't question. Our protective instincts override our caution. When we hear our mother calling our name, we answer automatically. It's programming that runs deeper than rational thought, and something has learned to exploit that programming with surgical precision. The psychological implications of this are profound and disturbing. We navigate the world through trust in our senses. We believe what we see and hear because we have to in order to function. Our perception of reality is built on the assumption that when we recognize someone, that recognition is accurate. Our relationships, our sense of safety, our ability to function in society, all depend on being able to identify the people in our lives correctly. But what happens when that trust is violated? What does it do to a person who has heard their spouse calling for help, has run to assist them, only to find no one there and later discover their spouse was somewhere else entirely? How do you maintain a relationship when part of your brain is always wondering if the person next to you is really them? How do you trust your own senses when they've proven unreliable in the most fundamental way possible? Some witnesses report lasting paranoia. They find themselves testing their loved ones, asking questions only the real person would know the answer to, looking for small signs of wrongness. They lie awake at night, listening to the sounds of their house, unable to trust whether the footsteps they hear are their family members or something else. Some have moved away from rural areas entirely, unable to shake the fear that something in the woods is still calling to them in voices they know. And here's the part that should terrify all of us. The mimicry is getting better. If you compare historical accounts to modern reports, there's a disturbing trend. The older stories often mention mistakes, small errors that gave the entities away. A voice that was almost right but not quite. A family member who forgot some crucial detail. Eyes that reflected light wrong. Skin that felt too cold or too dry. Modern reports mention these tales less and less frequently. The current generation of encounters describes mimicry so perfect that witnesses cannot identify anything wrong until after the fact, until they're comparing timelines and realizing the person they saw couldn't have been in two places at once. The entities, whatever they are getting better at being us. They're learning, adapting, improving their performance with each encounter. Multiple witnesses have reported something even more disturbing. They believe the entities are testing responses, learning what works and what doesn't. A voice calls from the darkness, and when you don't respond, it tries again later with a different inflection, a different emotional tone. It's experimenting, gathering data, refining its approach. This suggests intent, intelligence, purpose. It suggests something that learns from its mistakes. So where does this leave us? Standing at the edge of a mystery that refuses to resolve. We have the evidence, the recordings, the multiple witness testimonies, the cultural warnings spanning millennia. We have patterns so consistent they cannot be dismissed as coincidence or mass hallucination. We have modern cases with documentation that can't be explained by known psychological phenomena or technological trickery. But we don't have answers. We don't know what these entities are, where they come from, or what they want. We don't know if they're physical beings, interdimensional phenomena, or something else entirely outside our framework of understanding. We don't know why they mimic beyond the obvious tactical advantage it provides. We don't know if they're malevolent, indifferent, or operating according to motivations we cannot comprehend. What we do know is this: the phenomenon is real, it's persistent, and it shows no signs of stopping. Every year, new cases emerge. People continue to hear voices calling them in tones they recognize, continue to see familiar figures beckoning from shadows, continue to experience that moment of confusion when they realize the person they're talking to shouldn't be here, can't be here, isn't here at all. The warnings our ancestors passed down weren't superstition. They were survival instructions born from hard-won experience. When something calls your name from the darkness, don't answer. When you see a loved one where they shouldn't be, verify before you approach. When a voice beckons you to follow, resist the instinct to obey. These rules exist because people who didn't follow them didn't come back to share their stories. We live in a world where the evidence suggests something has been mimicking us for thousands of years, and it's getting better at the deception with each passing generation. Something that knows how we speak, how we move, how we express love and fear and urgency. Something that can copy these things well enough to fool the people who know us best. The next time you hear your name called from another room, the next time you see a family member in an unexpected place, the next time someone you love beckons you to follow them into the dark, take a moment. Verify. Ask a question only they would know. Look for the details that might be wrong. Because the alternative, the possibility that you're not talking to who you think you're talking to, is too dangerous to ignore. And as you lie in bed tonight, listening to the sounds of your house settling, remember this: if you hear your name being called from the darkness, if you hear a voice you recognize asking you to come closer, you should verify it's really them before you answer. Because something out there is listening to how we speak, and it's getting better at sounding like us every single day. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.